cover today
Yeah.
is just different ways to start a garden, what to plant and when, specifically for your zone, and different problems that you may have occur in your garden. So there are several different ways that you can grow vegetables. You can start vegetables from seed, you can start vegetables from plants, but the first thing that we're going to talk about is regrowing your vegetables from scraps. Is there anyone on the call right now who's already doing this? Okay, well that
Yes,
excites.
I am.
Okay, and what are you regrowing?
Me too.
Some peppers, bell peppers.
Okay, are you regrowing them from the seeds?
No, I just looked on the internet and they had where that you can just put them in the ground with the seed in it. And right now I have roots growing up. I mean, I have the leaves growing up from it from about a month doing that.
Okay, so you're actually regrowing it from the plant. So actually what we're talking about today is where you're able to regrow this portion is regrowing the vegetables from the scraps themselves. So that's exciting to hear that you're doing that. So there are different things that you don't have to
Fill
start
me in
from.
later.
Okay, and if you have not muted your mic, if you'll go ahead and do that for me, please. Okay, so there are several vegetables that can be regrown from the scraps themselves. So different things that you can regrow from the vegetables themselves are things like celery, onions, lettuce, cabbage, like specifically like romaine lettuce, especially. And the really exciting thing about that is it's very quick. So this is a really wonderful thing to do if you are just trying to make sure that you don't have to go to the grocery store as often, or a project that you're able to do with your children or grandchildren. And for the items that I just named, if you're trying to regrow it from the base, it's super simple. All you're going to do is you're going to cut the bottom off of the vegetables and you're going to place them in a very shallow bowl of water or a very small plate. And only thing you have to do is just change the water every 2 to 3 days. If you're seeing the growth just a little bit slow, you're going to add just a teaspoon of sugar to it, excuse me, a quarter teaspoon of sugar to it, and you'll actually see new growth from those vegetables in about 3 to 5 days. You can also do this like with carrots, you can do this with basil, you can do this with potatoes and sweet potatoes, but the process for those plants is a little bit different. With carrots, you're able to regrow it, but you will not be able to regrow the carrot itself. All it's going to regrow are the carrot greens, which are wonderful in salads and smoothies and so forth. And things like basil, rosemary, and some of the different herbs, if you have a clipping of them, you can actually place them in water and they'll grow roots that you're able to keep in your windowsill, or after a couple of weeks, you can place them in the garden to have a completely new harvest of vegetables. You can also do this with potatoes and sweet potatoes. Simplest thing to do with potatoes and sweet potatoes is the old-fashioned way of placing toothpicks in the vegetable and placing them in a cup of water where they're just barely touching the water. And you'll see new growth and roots over the next 7 to 10 days as well. And again, you can either continue to leave them in your windowsill to grow additional roots, or you can go ahead and put those sweet potatoes and the potatoes in the ground. With the sweet potatoes, please make sure that you remember that sweet potato leaves are fully edible, and if you've never tasted them, they are so wonderful cooked. They're also really great in salads. Before we go on to the next screen, I hear that there is a lot of static on the line. So if you are on the line and you have not muted your phone, I'm going to pause for just a moment so we can give everyone an opportunity to find the mute button on their phone, because there's some static interfering with everyone being able to hear. So again, if you have not muted your phone, if you'll go ahead and find that button for us so that we can make sure that everyone is able to hear clearly.
May I ask you a quick question, please?
Absolutely.
About the potato?
Yes, ma'am.
You said you cut the bottom off. When you put it down in the ground, do you put the cut bottom, or you put the root every time, right? Because you're saying root it first. You can't just put it in there without rooting.
That is correct. Now, if the potato already has what we call eyes, you know how you'll see the potato bags grow. If it already has eyes, you actually don't need to place it in the water to root it. You can put it in the ground. Putting it in the water to root will just encourage it to have stronger roots and will just expedite the growing process. But I'm glad that you asked that, because let me clarify, with the potatoes and the sweet potatoes, you do not have to cut the bottoms off. You can use the entire potato or the sweet potato, put the toothpicks in and place it in the water.
And when you put it with the eye on it, you put the root part that's up, or that little part down in the dirt, right?
Well, the eye of it, the part that you see growing on your potatoes when you forget about them in your pantry, that is actually the part that the plant will grow from. So you want your eyes pointing forward, because that's what's going to turn into your plant. Pointing up, excuse me, because that's what's going to turn into your plant.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, absolutely.
And
Before we
quick
go,
question, sorry.
absolutely.
For the onion, is it similar to the celery? You put the uncut part in the water?
That is correct. So especially like if you're using green onions or whole onions, it's the part that actually you can see the root attachment. That's the part that's going to go down in the water itself. And with the green onions are a little bit more difficult to do with this process. So generally when we buy green onions, we buy them already rubber banded together in a group of onions. So when I do this, I leave the rubber band on. I cut the parts off that I'm going to use, and I put the entire portion of the part that's rubber banded with all of the bases of the onion chives, and I place that part in the water with the root down. And again, you'll see those onions coming back up in about 3 to 5 days.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we go on? Okay, so now that we've talked about how we can regrow vegetables from the vegetables themselves, let's talk about starting from seeds. The most important thing that you need to know when you're doing your garden, and you're going to see this come into play as we move on into the next 5 sessions of our garden class, because next week what we're going to be talking about is actually doing your garden plan and how to plot out what you're going to be planting next. That is very so when you're starting from seeds, it's very important to know what your grow zone is. How many of you know what your grown zone is for the area that you're currently living in? Someone tell me what your current grow zone is, or tell me what it is.
I've seen both 7B and 8A, so I'm in between Snellville and Lithonia. It's technically Snellville, but
Yeah,
I've seen both.
yes, I actually see mostly 8A or 8B. We're definitely not 7B. So 8A or 8B is probably more about where you want to be. But I'm glad to know that you know it. Anyone else?
I'm 8A in Lithonia.
Okay. Okay, I see Andrea said that she is 7B. Okay. And so when we're talking about grow zone, what your grow zone is it helps you identify what plants should be grown in your area based on the average daily temperature for your area. So things that we can start in April, there are areas that are in New York or areas that are in the upper Northeast that aren't able to start those same varieties until months later. So knowing your grow zone not only tells you what is best to grow in your area, it tells you when you can plant, when you should be putting in your next cycle of plants, and so forth. And so if you Google what is my grow zone, or if you go to the USDA map, it will actually tell you exactly what your grow zone is based on your zip code. So when you're starting seeds, there's a few different ways that you can start seeds. You can start your seeds directly in the soil. And right now, since we're midsummer, you absolutely don't have to start anything indoors. You can directly place your seeds in the soil. The soil is warm enough. The only time that I would hesitate to encourage you for that right now is if you're going to be doing your cold weather vegetables. Cold weather vegetables are things like your broccoli, anything in your brassica families, like so the things that we love around Thanksgiving, Christmas, your cabbages, your broccoli, your cauliflower, your collard greens, all of those are more cold weather vegetables. And so right now, if you put them in the ground as seeds, they can do what's called bolting. Bolting means that plant knows that it's not been grown in the right time. And so instead of it getting those long, leafy, beautiful greens that we're used to seeing, what will happen is that plant goes into panic mode and it does what's called bolting. Bolting just means that plant immediately tries to produce flowers and seeds because it is in shock from the heat. So if you're planning on starting those, I would wait a few weeks, or if you'd like to go ahead and start them in your small pop-up greenhouses or indoors, this will be a great time to start those seeds indoors. Outside of those vegetables, including carrots and beets, anything else can still be started from seeds. Now, if you're going to be starting your seeds in a greenhouse, you don't have to spend money on gardening. I always tell people gardening was one of the last few hobbies that you can still do for free if you're very creative. So if you're starting seeds indoors, there's some different things that you can do to start the seeds. You can use recycled yogurt cups. You can use toilet paper or paper towel rolls. You can make seed cups from newspaper. So there's a lot of different ways to be able to do that for free. Now, when we're talking about starting in a greenhouse, I'm not expecting everyone to, go broke and buy this huge greenhouse. There are a lot of different like pop-up greenhouses that you can get, for $20 or $30 from any of your local garden stores. One of the other really exciting things that you can do is you can make one for free. So if you have a milk jug or anything like that, you can cut that milk jug in half, fill it with your garden soil or your seed starting soil, and then put your seeds in there and put the dome back on top, and it creates its own little mini greenhouse. So if you just want to get a jump start on your plants for free, that's a really great way to do it as well. Before we go on to the next slide, do we have any questions on anything that I just covered?
Do you need to use like one of those special light bulbs if you're trying to start it indoors with like a little greenhouse?
Yes, if you are going to start, and thank you, I apologize, I couldn't see my note, and that's one of the stars next to one of my notes, is if you're starting your seeds indoors, you can use a sunny windowsill if you're going to be diligent about turning those plants twice a day. If you are not going to remember to be as diligent with it, you definitely want to do a grow light. The reason that you want to do a grow light is because anytime you have something that's trying to grow, it grows from the sun. When it's trying to look for the sunlight, if you don't have sufficient light, meaning that the light is 6 to 9 inches directly above your plants, if it doesn't have sufficient light, it's going to search for that light. When it searches for the light, it becomes very leggy. And what happens is your stem will stretch for the light. I've had squash plants that sprouted on Monday morning that I thought would be fine until Tuesday morning. And I'll come that night and the stems will have grown 6 to 8 inches in a single day because they are stretching for that light. So if they are stretching for the light, what happens is you get very scraggly, limp, very slim stems, and so they're very weak, and when you put them out, they're not the healthiest plants. So you want to make sure that they have sufficient light so that they are all growing at a steady pace and not having to reach for that light. So great question, and thank you.
I have a question. So for those winter vegetables like your collards and broccoli, should we start those seeds now indoors or wait a little bit later?
If you want to get a jump start, go ahead and start them indoors. One of the other really exciting things that you can do with your winter vegetables, are you currently growing anything like tomatoes or peppers or anything that's creating a lot of shade right now?
Yeah, I have tomatoes and peppers.
Okay, well, those plants we're going to kind of start to die back over the next 3 months. So you can do what's called interplanting if you want to get a jump start. Interplanting is exactly what it sounds like. It is where you're planting new seeds in the midst of vegetables that are already growing. So like your peppers and your squash and your tomatoes that right now are huge and not really allowing a lot of sun to reach the soil, you can start putting in your brassica families around those plants. And so as those plants die back, the sun will hit the seedlings under it and they'll grow. So you can go ahead and put those seeds in right now if you want to give them a little bit of shade under other plants. Otherwise, I would wait until probably the last week of July, first week of August, or I would go ahead and get a jump start on them indoors. And at the end of today's session, we're actually going to start some of those seeds together outside.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions before we go on?
Quick question. Is cucumber a good one to interplant, or is that too like I don't want to say invasive, but it has been like taking over everything.
Well,
Can I interplant with the cucumber, or you just prefer tomatoes and peppers?
Well, no, you can interplant with your cucumbers as well.
Okay.
Anything that's creating a lot of shade right now that will give those plants the protection so that they're not trying to bolt from that direct sunlight, you can plant under. So cucumbers is another great one as well.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So when we're talking about things that you can start right now for your fall garden, um, you can start things still for your summer garden. We are in Atlanta. If you're not excited any other time about this heat, you should be right now, because what that means is that we have an extremely long growing season. So you can still put things in the ground right now, such as beans. You can still put in like green onions. You can, like I said, the interplanting, you can do broccoli, your Brussels sprouts, your beets, carrots, and other things. You can also start squash and cucumbers as new seeds. Those are not being interplanted. Those are direct seeds that still need full sunlight. And it's not too late to put those in the ground. You still have enough of a season to be able to have a full harvest by putting in new squash and new cucumbers. And that's actually one of the things that I do every month. I start new plants every month. I just pop them in where they can fit in the squash beds, because as we know, those squash bugs and vine borers are right now attacking your plants. And so as I continue my fight against them, I put in new babies just to make sure that I have a continuous crop. And one thing that I do want to caution you against, yes, there are still things that you can start from seeds, but things that are tropical plants, such as peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, those have a much longer grow season. So I would not start those from seeds at this point. I would only put in plants if you're still trying to start new things such as peppers, tomatoes, or eggplants.
So we could still set out a tomato plant.
Absolutely. I'm going to be putting out about 25 tomorrow. Yes,
Oh, okay. Are you in the Atlanta area?
I am. I'm in
Oh,
Lithonia.
okay, good. So we're in the same zone.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Right. Isn't that exciting to know that it's not too late? And I'll tell you, my tomatoes, my eggplants, my peppers, I usually don't pull those out until December. And I shouldn't admit this, but I love my peppers. So I actually pot up my peppers and bring them in. So I keep them, a lot of my pepper plants are between 2 to 4 years old. So if I can keep it, I try to.
For the peppers, sorry, we're asking so many questions, but this is really helpful. For the peppers, are you gonna cover that today, like bringing them in for the winter? Because that's what I want to do for some of mine.
No, I will not be covering that. That seed saving and storing plants, over the season is actually going to be something that I'm going to be covering in one of our last classes, because I'm trying to make sure that our classes are based on what you need for what's currently occurring.
Right
So
now.
we'll definitely be covering that, though.
Okay, thank you.
I
Absolutely.
have another question. So my tomato plants, all of a sudden one morning I woke up and they were looking dried. I mean, like they were dying. They still had little tomatoes on them. So should I pull those up and just put new ones in?
No.
No,
No.
leave them.
Yes, and I'm sure how many other people on here are growing tomatoes that when you go out, especially if you're going out full sun right now, they look like they're on their last little leg.
Yeah.
Tomatoes, it's hot.
They do.
It's very hot. If I spend 10 minutes out in the sun, I look like I'm on my last leg too. So with tomatoes, they are tropical plants, but just keep in mind that we have exorbitant heat, and so if you go out during the day and they're looking limp, and then you go back out at night after watering or in the morning and they've perked up, then they're fine. It's just that high heat of the day that they're just kind of suffering through it.
No, some of the leaves are dead. Some of the branches are like die,
Okay, if the branches are dead, is your soil moist? When you put your finger into the soil next to the base of the plant, does it still feel moist?
I water them almost every day when it's not raining.
Okay, always check before you water. I always tell people, especially since we are in ridiculous heat, those plants are going in shock right now. Before you water, stick your finger in. If that soil, when you reach down to about the second digit of your index finger, if it feels like super, super dry, then you're not watering enough, and your plants are kind of
Okay.
suffering for it. But let me ask you this, do you have mulch around those tomato plants?
No.
Okay.
I'm on the back deck, 25 plant, huge pots farmer.
Okay. Well, even with those huge pots, mulch is the one thing that can change your garden from looking from
Okay.
want and having to water on a consistent basis. I
Okay.
I try not to tell people this because they look at me like I'm insane when I say I really don't water. I have a huge water containment system, and when we go outside, remind me, and I'll show you my water system. We have a rain barrel system that holds 550 gallons, but I mulch very heavily, and because it's so hot and that heat takes my breath away, I rarely water in between rain unless I do what's called spot watering, where I can kind of see a plant struggling, and I'll make sure that they don't have to struggle. But that mulch really, really saves me. And since you're on a deck, you can also do a drip irrigation. But again, anytime before you water, I always just stick my finger in the plant because it just kind of helps me know, am I watering deeply enough and am I watering often enough? Because I should never stick my finger in that soil and feel dryness ever. Okay?
Charlie, I have a quick question.
Okay.
I'm looking at the list. It says cabbage. Is this the time to plant cabbage? I thought that was one of those things that needed cool temperature.
Right. And so if you look at the top, these are things that you can put in July and August. So with those, you can actually start those seeds in late July, beginning of August, and they'll be ready just in time for your Thanksgiving harvest.
Okay.
Okay. And my apologies, I saw some questions come up in the chat and they disappeared from my screen too quickly for me to see them. I think someone had a question about a plum tree. I didn't have an opportunity. My apologies. I am still new to Zoom. So if you can unmute yourself and just ask that question so I can make sure I can get it addressed for you.
I asked, will you be covering? I have plum trees and they are beautiful, green, big, but I can't seem to produce any plums. So
Okay.
I'm in Decatur.
Okay. And do you just have the one plum tree?
I have 3.
You have 3 plum trees. Well, and we're going to actually talk about flowering trees in a couple more sessions. That's going to be one of the last sessions, because with the plum trees, the season for those to produce fruit has already passed. You'll see a ton of white flowers in the beginning of the season. If you don't have fruit now in July, you won't have any this year. But in a couple more sessions, I'm going to talk to you about what you can do towards the end of the season to make sure that next year's plants are producing and giving you what you need as far as your fruit trees.
Great.
Okay. And I saw a few other questions in chat. So if you asked a question in text chat that I didn't get an opportunity to see, if you'll unmute your mic as we go through and just ask that question so I can make sure I address everyone.
My question was, is peat moss a good mulch?
Peat moss is a good mulch. And as we continue to go through, we're going to talk about some of the different sources of mulch. And you actually jump-started your homework assignment, because that's actually one of the things that we're going to be talking about for your homework. But yes, you can use peat moss and a couple of other things. And as we go through, I'll hit on some of the other things that you can use for your mulch.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Okay.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I've already planted my cabbage and my collards the end of April. So they've already started producing.
Mm-hmm.
Was that okay, or did I jumpstart it?
Well, you did jumpstart it, but were your cabbages, I'm sorry, you said cabbage and?
Collards.
Collards. Are they in an area where they're in like full sun, or are they in partial sun?
Full sun.
Okay. If they're in full sun, you may start to see, are you seeing that they're getting full-size leaves, or are they trying to bolt right now? Are they having?
Well, they're growing pretty good.
Okay.
Yeah, even my collard greens and my cabbage.
You may have gotten those in time, but are you starting to see any like caterpillars attacking them right now, or any white moths or white flies?
No. Well, you know what? With my collards, I see holes, so I put some of that Civen I forgot what it's called right now, but I put some type of powder on there to stop the worms from eating. Yes.
Oh. Okay. So Civen dust is not something I would ever recommend. I practice fully organic gardening. And Seven Dust
Okay.
is one of the ones that when I see it, it brings a tear to my eye. So you probably aren't seeing caterpillars right now if you're using Seven Dust, but there are other things that you can use to keep caterpillars and other things from eating your garden, specifically like diatomaceous earth. You can use neem oil and specifically BT. And if you asking me to pronounce that full name, I'm going to stutter all afternoon. But if you actually just Google B as in boy, T as in Thomas, BT is one of the best things that you can use for like your greens, and the reason that you're getting the bugs on those plants is because of it being summer. If when you grow those in their appropriate time, you don't really see bugs attacking them. Like I never have problems with my broccoli or my kale or my cauliflowers because I put them in usually between like January and February. By May they're out,
Okay.
and then I don't replant them again until August so that I don't have to fight the bugs all summer. But Google BT, throw that Seven Dust
Okay.
away, throw that Seven Dust away, throw that Seven Dust away,
Okay.
and Google BT and start using that and diatomaceous earth, and that will really help those plants along this summer.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, and before I go on to the next slide, are there any other questions? Okay, and we're going to go on to that next slide. Now, so we've talked about regrowing vegetables starting from seeds, and now let's talk about starting with plants. The most significant thing about starting with plants is you want to make sure that if you're buying plants from your local nursery, that you are following those plant directions exactly. If that plant tag says full sun, that's absolutely what it means. I get a lot of people who will, ask me questions about their plants, and then when I ask them to send me pictures or videos, I can see that they have, 20 tall trees around the area. And it's like, well, it's not getting full sun. So if plants need three things, they need water, they need sun, they need healthy soil. And if they are not getting sun, that is a key component. So if that plant says that it needs full sun, that means that 6+ hours of full sun. And then there are other things like peppers and tomatoes that want as much as 8 to 10 hours of full sun. So if you have an area of your garden that you're putting those plants in that's getting a little bit more short shade than what the plant tag is recommending, then those plants are never going to get the full size that they would otherwise because they're not getting the full nutrients that they need to be able to thrive. If the plant tag says either partial sun or partial shade, those are pretty much used interchangeably. That means that those need 3 to 4 hours of direct sun. So those are plants that if the garden is in full sun the first part of the day, but it's in shade in the afternoon, that would be a great place to put those plants that require partial sun or partial shade. The other thing is consistent watering. Get a lot of people who ask me what is happening with my tomatoes. Like they've cracked, they have what I call stretch marks, and a stretch mark on a tomato is formed when you are either not doing consistent watering or if we've had just an insurgence of rain. Tomatoes are very resilient. So what will happen is the tomato itself will actually stretch and it'll split and it'll reseal itself. So it doesn't actually change the flavor of the tomato. The tomato is still perfectly fine, but it's not as visually appealing because it does have those cracks. So if you are making sure that you are consistently watering, you can kind of avoid having to have issues with that. The other plants that really need consistent watering, so if you're growing any type of melons, specifically watermelons, key thing in that word is water. So if you're not watering them every day, or if you're doing inconsistent watering, they will crack. And unfortunately, unlike the tomatoes, if your melons crack, it's a loss. If they're almost fully ripe, feel free to eat it. Otherwise, it's a loss because it will not reseal itself, and it's just going to be fodder for the bugs in your backyard. One of the other things, I don't know how many of you are taking notes, but if you are taking notes, I'm going to pause so that if you have a highlighter or a pen that you can underline this. This is one of the most important, if not the most important thing when you're watering. You want to make sure that you are bottom watering. When we talk about bottom watering, that is where you are putting the water directly on the base of the plant. There is no plant that you are growing in your garden that ever wants water on its leaves. So when I hear about people who have sprinkler systems or who are just watering with a water hose, and then they tell me later on in the season that they're having spots on their leaves or they have blight on their tomatoes, it's because you are top watering. So you want to make sure that you put that garden hose right at the base of the plant, because again, if not, you're wasting water, because the only thing that needs to be watered on your plants are the roots. So we want to make sure that anytime that we're watering, that we're not just spraying that garden hose or the sprinkler, and that you're either using a drip hose or an irrigation line, or just making sure that you're applying that water directly to the root of the plant that you're growing. And the next thing is, when you're putting in plants, especially here in Georgia, you want to make sure that you're mulching those plants. Mulch is a savior. I'm not sure how many of you are first-time gardeners, but if you are a first-time gardener and you've been going out here right now in this July heat, it has to be shocking to you to realize that, you know, it's triple digits, and after 5 minutes outside, you are sweating buckets. So again, for me, I rarely water in between rain, unless it's been more than 2 to 3 days since it's rained. And so mulching your plants, and you can mulch with several different things. You can mulch with wood chips, you can mulch with old leaves, with your grass clippings. I personally use what's called coconut coir, and you can get them from your local garden store. I purchased mine through Amazon. So there are several different things that you can do with mulch. When you're mulching your plant, you want to make sure that that mulch is 1 inch to 2 inches thick. Mulch serves two purposes. It saves you from having to water as much. It also saves you from having to weed as much, and it just encourages healthier plants. One thing that I do want to just advise you, when you are placing mulch around your plants, you never want the mulch to be sitting directly against the stems of the plants. So you want to make sure that you're leaving 1 inch to 2 inch circumference around the stem of the plant, because when that mulch sits directly on that plant, if it rains and it's retaining water in that mulch, you will get what's called stem rot, which is where the mulch, where the stem of the plant will rot directly where it is in contact with the mulch. So make sure that when you mulch, heavily mulch 1 to 2 inches, pull that mulch back from the stem so that it is not in contact with that mulch, because in addition to it having rotting issues, it can also cause that plant to overheat. So make sure that you're paying attention to that when you mulch. Before we go on to the next slide, are there any questions on anything that I just covered? Well, awesome. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you have to keep putting the mulch on the plant?
No.
Around?
The mulch should last for the entire garden season.
Okay.
Okay, and let's go on to the next slide, please. Now, in Georgia here, we are preparing for our fall garden. I know that probably seems a bit early, because quite a few of us are still waiting on our tomatoes to turn red or yellow or whatever color we planted. So it is not too late to do, it's not too early to start your fall garden for some plants. So different things that you can still put in right now. If you have sweet potatoes, like the sweet potato slips, you can still put in tomato plants, you can still put in pepper plants, squash, cucumber, all of those things can still go in the ground right now. Any other fall plants, broccoli, cauliflower, collards, I would still wait another couple of weeks before I would set those out in the garden. And we can go on to the next slide. So there's different ways. So if you've been thinking about gardening, but you haven't gotten started, it's still not too late to get started. There's different ways that you can create your garden. You can plant your things directly in the ground. I know the majority of you who are on here are over in the same area that I'm in, and we have that ridiculous red clay that is a unique form of torture. So if you are going directly in ground, trying to till that red clay, I destroyed 3 tillers when I first started gardening, and I just kept thinking that I was doing something wrong and just didn't realize that clay really does not want to be tilled. You know, more than 10 plus years later, I recognize that really I don't support tilling, period. It really just disrupts the natural microbes that are in the soil and so forth. And so I personally do what's called lasagna gardening if I'm going directly in the clay. And that is essentially where you are building things on top of the clay so that you don't have to dig down. So you're layering that with like leaves and branches, compost, your topsoil and everything. So basically you are creating a raised garden without having to put a parameter around it. And it just gives you an opportunity to be able to utilize your clay without having to do that backbreaking work necessary to break that clay up. If you are going directly in the ground and you are just going to be building up on top of the clay, you want to make sure though that you remove just that top layer of grass so that it's not growing into your garden plant. You can also grow in different things such as pots. You can grow in, there's container bags now. You can do 5-gallon buckets. You can do hay bales. I have grown and tried every growing method possible over the last decade. And so don't be afraid to experiment. When I started gardening, YouTube was still a newer thing. But now I joke all the time, if you need it, I'm pretty sure you can find it on YouTube University. And so there are a lot of different ways that you can do raised bed gardens, but that growing in a container or a raised bed is my preferred method of gardening here in Atlanta. Now, when I move somewhere that actually has soil instead of clay, I'll definitely consider, going in ground, but right now raised beds are really just my preferred method. The reason that I personally prefer raised beds is, again, because with a raised bed, there are just several different benefits. I don't have to weed as much. It's a lot easier for me to water because they're going to be better at containing water. I don't have to get down on that ground. So it's really great for those of us who have mobility issues or who have back issues. One of the other things that I really enjoy about the raised bed gardens is that it gives me a way to just keep everything in separate compartments, and it's easier for me to manage the garden that way. With the container gardens or the raised bed garden, or if you're going in ground, your formula for your soil is pretty much going to be the same. You're going to be using topsoil, you're going to be using compost, which can either be homemade compost or compost that you're purchasing from the store. And then you're going to be using generally some type of manure. I personally use vermicompost for my manure, which is worm manure, but you can also use things like composted cow or chicken manure. There's quite a few farms in our area that will actually give it to you for free. If you have rabbits, that rabbit manure can go directly in your garden without having to be composted. And again, it's just a really, really great source of making sure that your plants have everything they need to get started. Before we go on to the next page, did anyone have any questions on the 3 different types of gardening that we just discussed?
Yes, for the raised bed gardening, that's what I have now. So I assume once I harvest everything that I will plant for the fall garden, it'll go kind of dormant since it gets a little chilly here for December and January. So once I get ready to gear back up for spring and summer, is that where I need to like re-add back like compost?
Yes.
Like what do how do you do that? Or like
well, when you're ready to start next year's garden, you're going to be adding in different compost, you're going to be adding in your manure and so forth. But I will suggest this before you get started with next year's garden. How many raised beds do you have?
Right now I have 2. They're actually connected, so it adds up to like a 4x8. But I wish I hadn't done that because sometimes I can't reach the inside of it. But it's about 4x8, but it's 2 4x4s.
Okay. Now, one thing that I suggest, and this is for anyone, reach out to either your county, your master gardeners program through your county, where you are able to get a soil test, and it's a nominal fee. It's maybe $8 to $10, and it comes back in, you know, maybe 7 to 10 days. And what it does is it tells you exactly what your soil has and what it needs. So before you get started next year, I would do a soil test. You can also purchase these from any garden center for a few bucks, but I would actually test to see what your garden needs before you just start adding things other than like your compost and manure. Those are your standard things that you're going to be adding every year, is additional compost and manure.
And is that a good time to do that, like January?
Yes, right before you get your garden started.
Okay.
What
Thank you.
Excuse me, what was the name of that you said? Master Gardener, what was that?
If you reach out to your county exchange office, the county extension office, they have a master gardeners program with every county, and you can actually have a soil test done through them. So if you search for DeKalb County soil test or DeKalb County master gardeners, that information will come up for you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay,
I
and
have
let's
a
go.
question.
Okay.
Okay. So I have pots. So when the tomatoes and all those things finish and I want to put a new plant in there, the winter plants, I mean the fall plants, for example, do I need to change that soil out?
No, you don't ever, and I get this question asked a lot, should I be changing my soil? No, and the reason for that is because the more you work with the soil, the more improved that soil becomes. So I would add additional things, you know, again, I would be adding fertilizer to the soil, such as, you know, compost and manure, but you're going to use that same existing soil. One thing that you want to make sure is that you are doing what's called crop rotation. And I apologize that I should have mentioned that to the last questioner. So crop rotation is just basically every plant that you put in the ground has different nutritional requirements. Crop rotation ensures that you are putting things in there that are not requiring those same nutrients, so you're not just depleting that soil. So if you look up crop rotation, it will tell you what should go in that spot next, so that you can make sure that you have the healthiest plants and that you are making sure that they have the nutritional balance that they need based on what was planted there previously. And we're going to actually be covering both crop rotation and companion gardening in next week's session as well.
Is
that answer
there
your question?
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
I think of somebody else though.
I was gonna ask any particular material that your raised beds should be made out of? Yes.
There's several different things that you can make your raised bed out of. If you're someone who's new to gardening and you're not quite sure if it's for you or not, you can use pressure treated wood. It is not recommended, and I'm sure if you've been gardening for years, you've heard all of the the talk about using pressure treated wood, and that is because the woods previously had like arsenic and different things in it that you didn't want in your food. But those are pressure treated woods that are more than 10 to 15 years old. New pressure treated wood is not my preferred material for raised beds, but it will last 2 to 5 years. You can put a liner in it. It's not toxic. It's completely safe. But my preferred thing for raised beds are cedar. Cedar will last you, 15 plus years before you have to replace it. It is, of course, more expensive, but it's rot resistant. So you can leave it out there for years and years and years with no problems.
My question was, someone told me that the topsoil has compost in it. Is that correct, or do I need to buy compost too?
No, you would need to buy you would need to buy compost. So when you're mixing it, you're mixing topsoil, compost, and manure, because topsoil is exactly that. It is not nutrient rich enough to support your plant life.
Okay, and I just go on Walmart or Lowe's and type in compost?
Yes, you can go into Walmart and to Lowe's and to look for compost, and they're gosh, what is the company's name? Is it Black Cow? That's in the yellow bag, and they have mushroom compost, they have chicken compost, they have cow manure. I personally, for myself, I only use mushroom compost or vermicompost. I don't use cow or chicken, but I don't recommend against it. It's just not my preference.
Are you using compost and manure interchangeably?
No,
Okay.
those are two separate things. Yeah,
Okay. Oh, okay. All right, thank you.
absolutely.
May I ask you one more question? I know you're not gonna get through with how you planned it. What we asked you so many questions, but my understanding is this: you have the topsoil, which has nothing really in it, because you're making the mix, right?
Right,
And then
right.
you got your topsoil. Then you have your compost, which helps the water kind of stay in it better.
Yes,
Then you have some kind of fertilizer or something.
yes, yes.
And then you put all them together and you got your own
Your perfect mix.
mix.
Exactly. Now, if you're buying something like Miracle Grow or anything type of like bagged soil, they've already done that process for you, so it's not necessary to amend.
Well,
But
that's what I
I,
was talking about.
yeah, yeah. It's if you're buying any type of like, those already will tell you that they have everything in it that you need. Those are not my preference. But if you're new to gardening and you're like, I don't want to spend that much energy trying to figure out how to mix soil, they will work in a pinch.
So is there a proportion that you do these three, topsoil, compost, and manure, or do you just kind of do third, or?
50%, you're going to do 50% topsoil and then 25% of the other two.
Okay.
Where are you adding the mulch to that then?
The mulch is what you're adding after you've planted, and you're putting it around the plants. You're not actually mixing it into your soil mix. This is mulch is just for top coverage to dampen down the weeds and to retain moisture.
And can I use mulch in, like, I have a planter box, like a raised box, like off the ground. I can use the mulch in that as well?
When you say mulch, tell me what mulch you have.
Well, I haven't gotten it yet, but you mentioned mulch, but I'm like, do I need to get mulch to put in that?
Yes, and that again is just going around the plants. And the reason that I ask that is because I have a lot of people who have been picking up the. We always see these advertisements for people who've gotten their trees cut down, and they say, "Come get this mulch." You never want to use those fresh wood chips in your raised bed, under the raised bed, because they are going to release nitrogen, which is going to inhibit the growth of your plants. So I just wanted to make sure that we were not speaking about that when you were talking about mulch.
No, not that, but thank you.
Okay. And my apologies. I am so glad that we have so many questions. But just for the sake of time, I think we have just a few more slides. So let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. Okay. A couple of important garden tips that I want to cover. You always want to make sure you include flowers in your garden. Someone tell me why. Why do we need flowers in the garden?
To repel
bugs.
To attract
Pollinators.
good
Attract
bugs.
bees.
Right, to attract
Pollination?
bees, attract good bugs. And then one of the other things, I get so many people who say, how do I stop the squirrels and the birds from eating my plants? Well, you put things out there that they want to eat instead, because your nature is all one continuous circle. So the flowers will attract the pollinators. I generally suggest that you have those flowers planted before you start your actual vegetable garden, because it will have the pollinators there so that when your plants come, they will already be there to help pollinate your garden. Pollinators are so significant. If you don't have bees and wasps and butterflies and other things there to pollinate your garden, you'll have what's called incomplete pollination, which means that you'll see where you have the flowers dropping off, especially off of squash, where you'll see the female flowers drop off with the fruit attached because they were not able to be pollinated. You'll also have to, potentially hand pollinate because you don't have things there to do it for you. Flowers are also significant because there are several flowers that repel bugs away from your plants. So using the nasturtium, using marigolds, those things kind of mask the scent of some other things. So if you put marigolds like around your squash plants, it kind of masks it so that you don't get such a huge onslaught of vine borers and squash bugs they're trying to take those plants out. Also, you want to make sure that you're feeding your plants. Feeding your plants, what I call side dressing, if you're using a like a dry fertilizer. Side dressing just means simply that you are coming on the side of those plants, putting your fertilizer on either every 2 weeks or every month, just to encourage the growth of those plants throughout the season. If it's a fast growing vegetable such as radishes, you don't ever need to fertilize them because they grow much too fast for the fertilizer to really have any impact on them. So you can put fertilizer in the soil when you first plant them, but it's not necessary to feed them as they continue to grow. I see we only have a few minutes left, and so let's go ahead and get through these last couple of slides, and let's talk about bugs in the garden. So I know for me, I always joke every single day. I'm like, I know my neighbors have to hate me because after more than a decade of growing, I still scream out there when the bugs get to me. So one of the things that I really had to learn are the bugs that should make me panic and the bugs that I should be excited when I see them. So there are several different beneficial bugs. Ladybugs. Ladybugs are the garden. I would also I would order like praying mantis. So all of those things are beneficial. And I know I skipped over this one, but spiders. Spiders are significant for your garden. I know we never want to see them, but they are there to kind of get rid of those bad bugs that are doing all the damage that we don't want to see done. Now, one of the things that I will strongly encourage you is anything that you're planting. So let's say you're planting squash. Google plant bugs that attack squash, bugs that attack tomatoes, and I would start becoming familiar with the pictures of those things that I need to look out for. So as soon as I see them out there, so like right now we have squash bugs, we have squash beetles, we have vine borers, we have tomato hornworms, we have tomato fruit worms, and you want to make sure that you know what those things look like so that if you do see those on your plants, you can make sure that you know how to get rid of them, how to treat them, so that before they become a problem, you're able to take care of that. Because again, squash borers and things like that, for those of us who have had issues with squash in the past, they can wipe out an entire crop in 2 days. So it's very significant that you're on the lookout. And I'll tell you this again, I am fully organic here. One of the main things that I consistently used in my garden for bugs was a hand vac. I am very squeamish with bugs, and so I would be out there with my little hand vac, vacuuming off all of the bad bugs, making sure that I'm treating them. And again, I've never had a tomato hornworm. There are several other bugs that I've never had, and the reason for that is because the number one bug prevention is a healthy soil. Bad soil will bring in all kinds of things. So start with a healthy garden, and you won't have as many bug issues. But let's go on to the next slide, please. Talking about problems with plants, when you have plants that have yellow leaves, that is the number one question that I get. Why are the leaves on my plant yellow? There are several different things. Overwatering can cause yellow leaves. Underwatering can cause yellow leaves. Those are the two easiest things to tell. If it's underwatering, I'll know it because I can reach in the soil and feel that the soil, when I go to my second digit, is sand dry. I know I need to add water. Overwatering, I can tell. I know if I've been watering 2 or 3 times a day and that soil, when I touch it, is super mucky, or I've gotten a lot of rain, I'll see some yellow leaves. There are other things that can happen. Blight. Making sure that you're mulching. So if you're getting blight on your plants, that can happen from poor airflow. It can happen from lack of watering, lack of mulching, meaning that when you're watering, that soil is splashing back on those leaves, which can cause spots and cause blight. So if you're putting in things like tomatoes, always remove the bottom leaves off of your tomato plant so that you don't have to worry about that splashback and that plight. The other thing, if you have yellow leaves, is do you have a pest issue? If you see yellow leaves and you've checked, there's no lack of water, there's no overwatering, there's no nutrient deficiency that I'm aware of, flip those leaves over and check to see if you have bugs. And a lot of bugs that are attacking your plants, you may not see them during the daytime. So one of the things that I started doing, because again, I'm obsessed with my garden, I would go out there at like 9 o'clock at night with a flashlight and see if I had a plant with an issue, I'd go out there with a flashlight at night and see, am I seeing something now that I wasn't seeing during the day, so that I can just kind of see what's happening. But so there's several different things, but just go down the checklist and just see why. And also, if a leaf has turned yellow, it's never turning back green. Cut it, and so that plant doesn't have to spend any more energy towards that leaf. If you have plants that have flowers with no fruit or vegetables, male flowers come first. A male flower comes first so that it can pollinate the female. Female flowers, you'll know that they're female because instead of having a straight stem, they'll actually have a small knot at the base of the flower, which is what develops into your fruit. So once those male flowers open to pollinate the female, those flowers drop off. So if you're seeing male flowers, it's no problem if those are dropping off. If you are seeing female flowers, meaning that there is a small bump at the base or an immature fruit, you are more than likely having those flowers drop either because there is excessive heat or because you don't have enough pollinators in your garden and you're having what's called incomplete pollination. And so before those females are getting pollinated by the males, the fruit is dropping off. If you're not seeing a lot of things buzzing around your garden, you can get a Q-tip and actually pollinate your flowers. And we're going to actually be covering that in next week's session as well. And let's go on to the next slide because I know I'm over time and I just want to hit this, which is just our question slide, so you guys can see we are officially at the end. And my apologies. I'm excited that we had so many people and so many questions, but we didn't have a chance to do our live demo, so we will hold that for next week. So before we close out, I just want to give you your homework assignment. And these are just the 20 minutes of homework. First thing I want you to do is to research mulch and different types of mulch. The second thing is researching if you know what you're growing. If you're growing strawberries, if you're growing whatever you're growing, Google whatever that plant is, bugs that attack it. Blueberries, plants that attack it. Tomatoes, plants that, bugs that attack it, not plants, my apologies. So I want you to be comfortable enough with what you're growing and what possibly are the pest issues that you could face with the plant. And then your third homework assignment is I'd like everyone to find something in their fridge or on the grocery shopping trip this weekend that they can regrow. So if you have celery, onions, any lettuce, I'd like everyone before this Sunday to start a plant that they can regrow so that we can talk about it during next week's session. Because again, if it started by Sunday, by next Friday, you should be seeing growth on that plant. I know that we're over the limit, Bridget, don't get mad at me, but I do want to open it up for any last minute questions. If it's a question that can be held until next week's class, please do. But if it's a question that you feel absolutely needs to be answered today, please feel free to unmute your mic and ask your question.
Marley, can you just repeat the homework, please?
Yes. First thing, you are going to research mulch. Second thing, you're going to research pests that may attack the plants that you're currently growing. And the third homework assignment is you're going to regrow something. You're going to find a scrap that you can regrow. Celery, carrots, onions, sweet potatoes, anything that was on our list. And if you don't remember the full list, if you Google plants that can regrow from scraps, it will come up with a whole list. And I just want you to find one of those and regrow it before our class on next Friday.
How do you control the mosquitoes? The mosquitoes are terrible.
Well, the mosquitoes, there are different things that you can put out for mosquitoes, like lemongrass, citronella, rosemary. Rosemary is actually something, if you're growing rosemary, if you rub it on yourself before you go into the garden, the mosquitoes are a lot less likely to bite you. If you do happen to get a bite and you've been using the rosemary, if you rub rosemary on a mosquito bite, it will stop itching and it will not itch again.
Thank you.